I use this diagram to try to explain how it is that our current our campaign financial donation system ends up with a two parties that no longer pay attention to what the public wants, and we end up with somebody like Donald Trump, uh, who obviously cares nothing or little or nothing about wisdom, but does appeal to the part of the public that the Democratic Party and the old Republican Party no longer address. So he now can exert complete control over the MAGA party. So what happens is when the Republican Party, back in the early 1990s, became focused on donors, when they focused on donors, they increased their donations. But as we saw work out very clearly in the early 2000s, what that does is that they employ their legislators to work on getting donations. What that means is that they can no longer spend time on legislation. And so what we saw in the 2000s is that as a legislator worked less and less and less on donations and less and less on legislation. And almost all their time was taken up working on donations. So the work on legislation became the domain only of the leadership and their staff, and of course the president and his staff. What happens when they become focused on donors is their donations increased. That had two effects. First off, incentivized the Democrats to up their game in terms of donation focus, but also it meant that the interests of the party became tied to donors, and not just big rich donors, but also to extreme donors. For instance, people who were only focused on the Second Amendment and gun access, or people who were focused on abortion. Both of these groups became big in the mind of the Republican Party, big donors. They were reliable donors. They were donors you could count on. People who were interested in tax cuts, rich people generally speaking, but everybody gets a little bit of cut in taxes. These people who believed this lie that you could cut taxes and it increases revenue, this fantasy, they were incentivized to keep giving more donations to the Republicans. Well, when the Democrats saw this increase in donations to the Republicans, they had to respond. They responded by focusing more on donors. And when they did, you get the same kind of thing. Their donations went up, but their focus on legislation dropped, and their focus on non-donors, working with people who the ordinary folks, the ordinary voters, their focus on ordinary voters decreased because they had no time any longer to really find out what regular people were interested in. These are extreme ways of putting it, but the point is that it went down. Now, when the Democratic donations went up, this also incentivized the Republicans to increase their emphasis on donors. And of course, we saw changes in the emphasis on the Democratic side too. So less interest in things like retirement, or less interest in things like helping the poor. So TANF has continued on, and AFDC was long gone, and by the way, interest in protecting us from bank failure dropped off the radar. So that the extreme positions became enhanced because of the defective donations. And of course, the Democrats also reduced their work on legislation and their ability to meet with non-donors. Now, when this happens, when you focus on the extremes, you get two things happen. You get emphasis on tooth fairy economics. The whole idea that cutting taxes increases revenue. Reagan tested that out in his office and he decided that didn't work. And he actually reversed his taxes. And the first George Bush also, again, he raised taxes because he couldn't believe this is true. But it became mantra within the Republican Party. And of course, the problems we had in funding Social Security were obvious in the late 90s, but the Democrats didn't want to touch it, nor did, of course, the Republicans. And so we dived into this extreme deficits driven mainly by Medicare, the fact that Medicare is not really paid for by taxes, and the taxes for Social Security are not. And all, by the way, a lot of rich people get Social Security, even though Social Security was defined to be a poverty program. And a lot of the money, so this is just tooth fairy economics. The tooth fairy is going to pay these deficits. At the same time, trust in government dropped off because of this emphasis on these extremes. Now, if you had focused more on legislation, that would tend to increase the trust in government, whereas focusing on extreme reduces it. And if you had been able to spend more time with non-donors rather, that would have tended to reduce this emphasis on tooth fairy economics. But what we have is because of so much focus on donors, we have had this really, really severe magical thinking we've had for the last 25 years, and the trust in government has really dropped off completely. Now, with tooth fairy economics, you get all these crazy things, like people believing that there's a trust fund that can pay Social Security, which is ridiculous. There is no trust fund. There's an accounting. There's a book somewhere that says the claims to have money, but there's no money there. All Social Security deficits are going to come out of the American public eventually. Either come out of it by decreasing spending by the government or increasing taxes. And so we've got this annual big deficit, and we've got this huge and growing debt to GDP ratio, all of which increases the risk of financial collapse and inflation. Or, and with either one, you're going to force service cuts the government's not going to be able to afford to do what it's doing now. And, of course, this annual deficit reduces the confidence in our bond market, which, of course, increases the risk of collapse. And as trust in government goes up or down, so does the market confidence and the trust in the parties. These are driving this campaign finance system is driving everything.